Hello, beautiful people. Kelani, can you tell me if I'm live? I'm always conscious. Hello, 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 beautiful people. I am just making sure that we are live on the Soulstainable Living page. I need to figure out, Facebook is always changing the way that things are organized. So I need someone to um, checking in. Can you hear me, Dr. Arlette? So, okay, I see you there. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm live. Thank you, Sash. All right, good people. So I am here on Facebook Live. I want to talk to you, talk with you about John Lewis, Good Trouble. Really feeling encouraged today. I know that his memorial service was online, and I actually did not watch it. I felt like it would be too emotional for me to watch the conversations about his life in real time. I did see a video of his body being carried across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and that really choked me up emotionally. I absolutely am in love with John Lewis in a way that it's not romantic, it's not anything, other than a great deep respect for the life that he has lived, the life that he has committed to social justice, the life that he has given to us. For those of us who may not even see themselves as being any bit of worthy to walk in the same time that he did. So I just want to take a moment of silence to hold space for the great elder, to thank him for what he has done, and to send him off again with a very heartfelt, well done. So if we can just take a few moments of silence. All right, beautiful people. So I want to start this conversation off today. Someone texted me a question prior to the start of the live, and the question is simply, I have to get up my phone. How and why do you use film in a literary practice? And so I know that this is not my classroom in the traditional sense, but everywhere that we go, if we're an educator, we know we use those spaces, hey sis, to be able to share our knowledge. So for me, I do teach literature. I'm a literature professor, as one of the disciplines in my professional career. And for me, I always use film in my introduction to literature class and my black lit classes, my composition class, any class that I teach. I understand that there's an immediacy of film that sometimes the written word people are not able to get to really vibe with. And so for me, I think that when I think of literature, it doesn't have to be this rigid category of this published classic book. I think we get literature in many different ways. I think text messages are literature, and not in a high classical sense, but they contain information. If you were an anthropologist or some sort of cultural anthropologist, you would be able to look at a particular time's communication patterns by the telephone, by text message, by written letters. So there are many ways that we catalog our history. There's many ways that we use communication. There are many ways that we tell stories. And film for me is just that other extension. Even though I'm not a big movie watcher in terms of like fiction movies, I live in a house with filmmakers and people who are doing movie scores. And for me, when I look at a sentence on a page, I understand that a camera, a film shot, can convey the same sort of message that a semicolon or that a period can do, or a double dash. And I think that it's a disservice if anyone teaches literature or even history and they do not include images, whether they're photographs or whether they're moving pictures. Um, Dr. Arlette Miller Smith says film gives us a virtual remembering coming from Toni Morrison's work. This sort of putting together, we talk about dismembering things, which is the breaking apart, but the remembering is the putting together of a thing, and especially in terms of documentaries. So, documentaries as a genre is my absolute favorite way to view films outside of cartoons. I love history. As an English person, as a reader, as an instructor, it's so important to me to be able to get first person narratives. And I like actual facts, and to the best way that a documentary might not be a skewed version or a biased or a slanted version. For me, documentary just offers a way to put together history, to have you interact with history in a way that is up close and personal, particularly if you did not live in that era, but also the factual nature of what a documentary is supposed to do, supposed to exist in real time. Rachel, I know you love the documentary. I do want to call people's attention to a couple of things that we can talk about, well, that you might want to use for further information. So, I was on Rachel's radio show recently, and I showed these books in here. So, March, book one, March, book two, and March, book three. They are the graphic novel versions that John Lewis presented of his life. So he is with Andrew Aiden and Nate Powell, book one. I just want to open it up. He talks about his chickens and how, as a child, he always had the chickens as his audience for his church or his congregation. And so we have the graphic illustration and outline of that. And it's a very straightforward, it's a young adult novel. I'm sure it could be maybe middle grades, but definitely young adult. And it just takes you through his life, centered on the March on Washington, but all throughout his life. And another thing I want to tell you is actually, and Kaylani is dropping the link to Penguin Random House for you all to be able to get more information about how to purchase the books. Yes, you can find those there. Thank you so much, Kaylani. I also want to tell you about his documentary. So we are talking today about John Lewis Good Trouble, but there's another documentary that came out several years ago that I absolutely loved. It's 54 minutes. It's on PBS. I know you right now you can watch it through Amazon Prime. I know that for sure. And I'm going to share oh, Kaylani, you'll share that with us. It's the John Lewis Get in the Way documentary. Do you have the book where he is preaching to chickens? Yes. So in March 1, when he talks about his childhood, there's an example, there's an illustration we see right here of him talking to the chickens in March 1. And so here's his chickens are his congregants. So we get that story in real time. And he said, I imagine that they were my congregation. And then he goes on to, yes. So in the comments, you will see how to link to the Get in the Way documentary. It is on PBS, but it's offered right now, at least I know it's on Amazon Prime for free with the price of admission, or your subscription rather. But that documentary also is very rich with John Lewis's life and his legacy, and it answers some questions that may not necessarily be answered on the oh, hold on, sis, I didn't mean to type, like, hold on, y'all, oops. I'm sorry, I'm gonna turn my phone off. I am, doing multi things. Let me text someone and tell them that I am live. This is the benefit of live television, live casting. Oops, I'm live, sis. We'll call back. All right. Oops. So anyhow, the Get in the Way documentary I think works really well with the John Lewis Good Trouble, because there's some overlap. You'll see a lot of the same themes and the same footage. You'll see John Lewis as himself, fully invested in the movement. But as I was talking to a friend earlier, that you know what, this one right here, I have that in my office. I preaching to the chickens, and I have that in my office at work. And so for those of you who are interested in preaching to the chickens, this is Young Story that is Rachel, thank you so very much, has just dropped that comment into the Dropbox. And this is what we do. We're creating a toolbox of information for those of you who are parents or instructors or aunties or other village elders, and you are in charge of giving information to other people. You have young people in your house or older people in your house, whatever that you bump up against with. We want you to share information. This conversation will be really different than the others that we've had. It'll be a lot shorter, but I could not exist in this space and not give honor to the good elder, the good Congressman John Lewis. So let's have this conversation. So when we think about good trouble, and when we think about John Lewis's life and the ways that he has been able to stand up in his truth, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King thought of him as a son. He was really a man of conviction and put his body. We saw that when him crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. We saw that was forever being chronicled as Bloody Sunday. When we think of John Lewis's Good Trouble, what sorts of things does that call up for us in our own lives? Like, what are the ways that we, in the spaces that we are in, can get in some good trouble? Rachel says that John Lewis is a man of destiny. Yep, and Arlette says that it's the chicken stories is also referenced in March 1. I'll start for myself. So I have been raised by my grandmother, my grandparents, really. My grandmother, my grandfather. My grandmother always looms larger than life for me. So you'll hear me talk about her. Hi, Lisa. When I think about good trouble, from a very young age, I was encouraged to participate in the community. So I have to find this news clipping, Rachel. There's me at about 5 or 6 years old, and I am helping to plant a community garden. And that's the person that I've always been. Shout out to Miss Helen Corley, because it was because of her influence. And she was my cousin's godmother. We lived in the same house, and she would come get me and participate in some community stuff, as well as the neighborhood that I grew up in, and the legacy of my grandmother's own desire to help people out. So I've always understood that my life is measured by the ways that I'm able to help people who are in need, and not just help people who are in need, not expect anything from them, not trying to, get public acclaim for that, not trying to go tell someone, oh, I helped this person win, not trying to place myself as being better or greater in some ways, but just understanding that being a servant and being a person who could help other people, even if some people wanted to discard them. And that's where the troubling parts come in. It's easy to help people when everybody thinks that they need help. But when we talk about people who might not be, who might be addicted to drugs, people who might have a past in the criminal justice system, people who might be considered people who are living on the margins of any society, those are the people that it costs something to help, right? That we sometimes get caught up in, doing the pretty thing, even when we want to do good. And I think when I'm thinking about John Lewis's example, one way of interpreting good trouble is being mindful of the good, right? And how we trouble the waters is that we do the thing that is not necessarily easy. We do the thing that is good and that is right. And so I think for myself that that's one significant way that I've always wanted to be of some use. And it's something that I encourage in my students and in my children. Rachel says that children come as who they are and are guided by wise people like your grandmother and John Lewis's parents, and like your grandparents and your parents. And we have to understand that our lives are not just our own, that we have plenty of people inside of our houses and outside of our houses that are watching what we do. And even though John Lewis did not set out to be this political figure, we understand that his mission, whether he was president of SNCC or the chair of SNCC, whether he was a member of Congress, whether he was a college student or a young boy preaching to his chickens, that the general fabric of who he was remained true. Like, he was someone who wanted to bring joy and happiness and connection to people, understanding. He wanted to use peaceful means, and he used all the tools at his disposal to be able to bring about community. And that's what I think that we might be missing sometimes when we look at the current state of politics, or we look at people who are in political office or activism, or someone who might not feel that they're great enough, whatever that means, right? They're great enough to do good works. And I think that that's the thing that we have to, if we really want to honor John Lewis's life or create our own legacies, we have to be willing to trouble the waters. So, hey, my cousin James is on here. James says race prejudice has unfortunately become an American tradition, which is uncritically handed down from one generation to the next. The only remedies are enlightenment and education. This is a slow and painstaking process in which all our right thinking people should take part. John was a pioneer. Psst, come on, cousin. And we grew up, James and I grew up in the same neighborhood side by side. Some of the same people raised us, really being mindful of the impact of racism. Rachel says, I love the notion of still waters requiring troubling. Still waters get stagnant and breed unsavory things. Kind of funny when you consider the notion of still waters run deep, which is actually making a different point. Mm. So here we have this history of prejudice that's handed down and racism. And here we have this notion of something that can stay the same, like this still water. So we go in here, and in order for us to dismantle this racist system, we have to trouble, we have to agitate, we have to shake up, we have to employ tactics that are not necessarily handed to us, but we have to understand that it's our birthright. John Lewis is the perfect example of that. He didn't come from a degreed family, even though it is important to note that his family had hundreds of acres of land, right? So land is money, land is wealth. And his parents, although they were not formally educated, they encouraged education in their children and they supported him despite their fears. And I think that, when we look historically at what has happened in our country, and what we see that what John Lewis did with the freedom rides, what he did with the March on Washington, what he did with marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, what he did as a congressperson, being able to move beyond that point of fear, being able to trouble those still waters, being able to disrupt a historical unjust system, and to be able to say, you know, I know people think that he is or he was someone who was um a yes kind of man, and that he wasn't militant enough, and he says it too, you know but his impact was powerful. And Rachel, you are absolutely right. School does not create intelligence. And I will offer this as an educator: in some ways formal education stifles creativity if we are trying to do it in the same system that has been unequal and unjust. Brown versus Ferguson, anybody? Dr. Arlette Miller Smith says, and they still own much of that land. That is where, they have some sort of power. But his mother also was very afraid of him being an agitator, because when he was trying to go to college and he hadn't heard back, because she did not want to lose the land. And that, to us, like, well, what do you care about the land? Well, 100 something acres of land now is not a small thing. And so imagine that during the time that he was growing up, to be able to have a family that owned their family's land, and not just a small plot of land. Like, we were like, oh, I got 1 acre, and we'd feel rich. But to have 100 something acres of land is phenomenal. And so I really, I'm hoping that some of you will share your own experiences about what, James, I know you've been in AmeriCorps. Rachel, I know that you do your art activism and, working on your equity work. Dr. Arlette Miller Smith, you are an educator. You created um, a coma, and you grew up in Mississippi. So let's see. So to your point, Rachel says, was he the most effective troubling on the inside? Ooh. Or outside? Was he the most effective troubling on the inside or outside? And anybody can answer this. I, ooh. Okay, so let me say this. I think it was important that he troubled on the outside to get in the inside. I don't think that he could have done it the opposite way, that he would have troubled on the inside and then left politics and gone on to be a person of the people. I just don't, it wouldn't have worked that way. I believe that the fact that he was able to create, he did some community building, he gained the people's trust, He put in some mileage. He did time in jail. He said he was arrested 40 some times or whatever, and then he was arrested more times after he became a politician. Um, yeah, I think that both he does. He impacts, and Dr. Arlette Smith is coming in here saying it both. I think that his time outside of the movement, outside of politics, was significant, and he needed that time. But he had a different level of impact on the inside because he has the ability to impact laws. So both. James says both. Arlette says both, most in terms of inside the formative years. So as in his formative years, right, that shaped who he was. Like, how are you 16, 17, 18 years old hanging out with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? How do you go into a room and you are just sitting in the face of someone who is crafty, who was very young himself? Like, we forget that Dr. King was only like in his 20s, when we first became introduced to him, right? So just this young, vibrant preacher who was destined to take over the world, and you're having first name conversations. Rachel says that was my big takeaway from the film and seems particularly relevant now. In what ways? Like, if we that the both him being able to be impactful inside as well as outside, or like, what was your takeaway? Because for me, it just, I think the documentary in some ways is really for people who don't know a lot about his life. The other documentary, I think they work well in tandem with each other. Um, but his spirit, like last night when I was watching the film, I was crying because, like, there were parts of his philosophy sometimes that I may not have I don't want to say agreed with, because I don't know if I have enough, who am I to disagree or agree? But when I think about his hope and his desire to want more from us, I I could not help but feel like we needed people to be hopeful. And if he didn't give us anything more than that, to be bust upside your head, come on. So, Good Trouble, Arlette says, Good Trouble used boldness to seek out MLK, wrote him a letter. Okay, the audaciousness of him writing him a letter, like, I can't get into the school. They haven't written me back. They haven't let me know anything. But to be the sort of person to be audacious enough to write Dr. King. And then Dr. King writes him back and sends him a train ticket or a bus ticket, and he goes. How many of us would have just said, "Oh, I'm not going"? Rena says, meeting Dr. King. Being able to meet Dr. King, to be able to be his student, to be able to be his mentor, to be his son, to sit with the big six of civil rights, to be able to have a platform at the March on Washington, to be able to represent SNCC, even when you're told you're not supposed to represent SNCC. You go across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, you want to protest, you do not represent SNCC, but then be asked by lawmakers and other legislators, will you represent SNCC? He knew he was a man of destiny. So when we think about our current situation, oh, what did Tiana say that I somehow missed? Tiana, I didn't see your comment. Type it back in there. Because I see Dr. Arlette saying, right, Tiana. Oh, Tiana just says, right to you. So when we talk about that man of destiny, how many of us are afraid for what we see as our own legacy to make change? Right out, Tiana, I'm going to shout you out. Tiana's been doing this thing called Movement for the Movement, where she is using her actual physical body to do workouts. And the money that she's raising from the workouts, she's donating to different organizations that are working to liberate Black lives. Is there a point in her life that she might have known that she would be a person to help other people? Like, how do we know what our destiny is? James said to be hit upside your head and still, come on, and still show love to the state troopers and forgive the people. I saw an episode of Oprah. This was many years ago, and they had the Freedom Riders on there. Now, I'm obsessed with the Freedom Riders. 1961 was a really significant year in the civil rights movement. We know 63, we know 68, but 1961, May, we have the Freedom Rides taking place. Those young people were signing their lives away. They were making their last will and testaments, whether they were college students, whether they were married people, whether they were employees. They said, listen, we're not going to, we know that we won't be here, right? And to be able to forgive the people that were blowing up the buses, the people that were dragging them off the buses and busting them upside the head. So John Lewis got hit in the head several times, not just by the state troopers. He got hit in the head by common people, you know. Rena says the Avenue Fellows talked a lot about how everyone thought he was different. They related to that. So for those of you who are, and I'm always talking about what people are doing. So we have a coma with Arlette, we have 21st Century Arts with Rachel, we have the Avenue Black Box Theater with Rena, we have Movement for the Movement with Tiana. So different. When we this can we tease out that different, Rena? Can you tell us what different means? Like I know particularly with the Avenue Fellows how that could represent itself, but we want a movement that's not hierarchical. We don't want people to think that they're better or that the movement looks like that. Like you have to come. We're not trying to Claudette Colvin anybody, you know, versus Rosa Parks. We understand that if everybody is supposed to get free for Black people, we bringing everybody along with us. Arlette says that time for him was being mentored by King and other civil rights leaders was absolutely huge. Tiana says, I have no idea what I will become, but worry about failing. But I continue to apply that pressure. Rena says, you know, his family and his mentors. Rachel is replying to James. And the reason I always try to read most of the comments is because sometimes when you're watching the review, you don't necessarily see, especially if I send this to YouTube, you won't see the comments. So I'm reading those out for us. And not in the sickening ways like hugging the murder of your relative in court. And Arlette said he was one of the few who shouted out women in the movement. Can we talk about the 5 minutes that they spent on his wife? Not even 5 minutes that they talked about the way that he loved his wife, the way that he was able to see this woman who was born in California. I was like, okay, California, but just the dignity and the honor of their equal yoking. The fact that you have a man who is obviously around a lot of women, you know, who's spending his time. Diane Nash was his contemporary, who was a dynamic figure and being around a lot of women, powerful women in the movement. But like Dr. Arlette says, that he always was very mindful. And I'm trying to think how I even learned about John Lewis, but I feel like it was through something connected with a woman. And that for me was the thing that made him impactful to me. But I did learn something in the film last night that I never paid attention to. That John Lewis had a uniform, that he pretty much just wore a blue suit with a blue tie all the time. Rachel says, looking at the film reminds us how leaders don't just come in one age. He led as a young person and demanded respect even then. Not just demanded respect, Rachel, but he also commanded respect. That, you know, he didn't have to talk loud. He didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to curse. He didn't have to get in people's faces. He could be soft spoken and powerful. You know, Rena says exactly, not better, but different. I think from the standpoint confidence in your methods, perhaps not looking like what was already happening, but still finding your own way. And that speaks to Rachel's point about youth. Sometimes we forget that many of our activists, our movements are led by young people. Martha says, so an elder always said you cannot avoid suffering in life. You either suffer for right or for wrong. John Lewis always has exemplified that for me. He was my visual of that. Martha, is that a quote from somebody or just an elder in your family? I like that. Better word commanded. James said, I'm kind of confused. Where was Jesse Jackson? So I think that, or we saw Jesse Jackson in the documentary a little bit. I don't believe they were not Jesse Jackson and he were not contemporaries in the sense that they were always working together. You see Jesse Jackson more aligned with Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but he also was a preacher in his own right. You know what I'm saying? Not that he was his competition, he was younger. So remember the day that Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, we see him on the balcony at the hotel. But I don't ever like I know that there's mutual respect, but I can't recall seeing so much overlap between John Lewis, and that's something we can look at. Rachel says, I love how he talks about the current Black Lives Matter movement. And Martha says, yes, her bonus dad is the one who told her that you either suffer. I got to go back to that quote. You cannot avoid suffering in life. You either suffer for right or for wrong. If you are able to choose, right? Oh, Dr. Arlette, you are absolutely right. It was Ella Baker, and I'm going to tell you my story. Rachel says he did not forget the space and respect the Carter's path that he was given. So my daughter was in elementary school. I knew about John Lewis, of course, before my daughter was in. She's 22, so she probably would have been 8 or so. But I think my great love happened for him around this time. Okay, so she was in school and she had to do a project that was Black History flashcards. Each child in the classroom had to come up with a deck of cards. So all of her classroom peers did like rappers and singers and athletes. No shade. I knew that that's not what we were doing in this house. Kaylani did a civil she did a civil rights flashcard, and Ella Baker was somebody that we studied. Like me and her, we just and I fell in love with Ella Baker. We got to find the Ella Baker book to talk about. I fell in love with Ella Baker, and Ella Baker, listen, if you talk about the civil rights movement, you talk about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you cannot talk about the anything with Dr. King without talking about Ella Baker. Ella Baker was so dynamically powerful. And so that is absolutely right. That learning about her, Kaylani, yes, I remember that project. Learning about Ella Baker. I mean, we knew about a lot of people, but Ella Baker stood out for us. And that's how we made the connection even greater for myself with John Lewis. Yeah, so and so she was like in second, third, or fourth grade, maybe I don't know, but it was a young grade, and it just was so powerful. So when we think about John Lewis, and we think about voice, and we think about difference, and we think about presence, and we think about respect, there is not one way to gain respect. There are a lot of times that we feel like we have to be the loudest in the room, the loudest on the microphone. We have to be the person who is doing the absolute most. But Tiana, your example shows us that we can start right where we are, that I can use my physical body and I can do something that I do well, work out, and I can raise money and donate to help other people get free, right? And so you'll see us, I do a dollar ask. Anybody got $1? We'll go to the social media platform. Somebody has inboxed me, or I know somebody going through something. Um, and we start asking the community for dollars to help them. These are those same ways that we are able to enact liberation. Arlette says, I'm in love with Sweet Honey's song, We Who Believe in Freedom, dedicated to Ella Baker. I can't get enough of Sweet Honey and Rock either. I try to play them as much as possible on my radio show. Me, Rena, and Rachel all have radio shows on WAO FM. My show is on Mondays at 5 o'clock, and then again on Sundays at 8 on Jazz 90, 8 a.m., and my 5 p.m., and then Rena's Golden Goddess Hour is on Thursdays at 8 o'clock, 8 to 10. And then Rachel's 21st Century Arts, new name, is on Tuesdays from 10 to 12 a.m. to 12 p.m. noon. We can't forget his legacy fighting voter suppression specifically. We honor him by voting. We honor him by voting. So when we think of the vote, remember the scene when Skip Gates said that he found John Lewis's great I think great, maybe it's three greats, but I know two great grandfathers um, voter registration card, and that there had not been a voter in his family between that great grandfather, maybe one more great grandfather, and John Lewis. Imagine that you can trace the first vote in your family to the second vote in your family. And that distance is measured in generations. We don't think of that. Because I know for me, my husband votes. Our kids vote. We make it a family event. My grandmother, who just turned 93, she votes, even though she has a harder time voting now because they started having you fill out the form instead of pulling the lever. So that disenfranchised a lot of voters. We see in the documentary that we have people who were waiting online to vote for hours. So Rachel says, I really related to that with Carter Maddox, right? So that's her. How many greats, Rachel? You got to tell us the story here. I know it, but now I'm fascinated with Rachel's family. but she was able to find what his voter, his him in the census, the 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 census, and having this family of going back hundreds of years and being able to see who owned land, what people's names were, who was able to vote. So voting is a way that we disrupt the current model of government. So great, great, great for Carter Maddox and our Let's Preach on Rachel. That's what she's telling your comment. So when we look at Rachel's great, great, great grandfather and John Lewis's maybe great, great, or great, great, great grandfather, and able to connect this modern era, because John Lewis just died, right? He's 80 years old. He just died. We didn't see that he had grandchildren or anything like that, but he's connected to us and all of our children. And to be able to understand that the significance of voting. So Rachel's relative ancestor was voting in 1867 in Georgia. I believe that's the same time that John Lewis's um, ancestor was registered as well. So we don't have enough information. Okay, all right, sis, come back to the replay for sure. So when we talk about, the the significance of voting. So in my other life, as my professional life, voter registration is what my Black Student Union, that's our call to action. Like we each have pillars and themes that we think. So my club talks, we do civic engagement. And voting is one of those pillars of civic engagement. So all of our events, we have voting registration forms. We hold 2 or 3 voter registration events a year. And then before the November election, we have a what's that called? A an event where we have elected politicians, black and brown politicians from this area, come in and sit with my students, not the campaign, to talk about, just talk to them one on one. My students might have an issue, and I'm trying to figure out how to do it in this COVID era. But what I want us to remember is that voting is a tool of disruption, right? Marine says, right. And it was so meaningful for him that he got emotional. Happy anniversary. When he was presented with a voter registration card, gave me chills for sure. Not only that he got emotional, but Skip Gates described in detail, and Rachel, I know that this is what you love about John Lewis, and how he put his head down and he wept and he wept and he wept. Just that quick action of an emotional outpouring that he was presented with this voter registration card, and knows that something that existed before he even knew himself has been bequeathed to him. And so I want to ask us, and it's not something that you even have to answer in this conversation, but what is it that you are leaving for your future generations? What were your children or your nieces or nephew, or maybe you won't have children. I don't want to disconnect anybody who's not going to be a parent. But what will people who come after you be able to pull from your life? Rachel said, great men cry. Oh, let me go back to Arlette's comment. Okay, Dr. Arlette says, my grandfather who raised me, Dr. Arlette Miller Smith, so that would have been Arthur Miller. My grandfather who raised me forbade me to go to voter registration programs in Vicksburg, Mississippi in the mid 60s, but the first election after the Voting Rights Act passed, Arthur Miller put on his hat and walked to the polls. All right, granddaddy. Ain't nothing like a old black person going to vote. There's no pride, there's no dignity, there's no honor, there's no resistance like an older black person going to vote. Young people, of course. But there is something for me to look at my grandmother who is 93 years old. No matter what the year, no matter what the time, she going to vote. And not just going to vote, she bringing my auntie, her kids, her grandkids, everybody. Like it was never, and I know like this is not a discussion about what do voters do, what's the purpose of vote. That you can have that discussion with your friends, you can have it with your family around the coffee table. I'm saying that for me, voting is one of the tools that I have in my arsenal to disrupt the system. Because if you're going to take my vote, you're going to take my vote. You're going to have to steal that vote. Because I'm not going to be at home sitting around not giving the vote. I'm voting. So Marion said that was such a powerful moment. Do you catalog? Do people catalog when they go vote with their families? Every year on Facebook, we take our every all the elections, not just the presidential elections. Y'all got to get out of just voting for the president. Got to get out of just voting for state elections. We got to vote at the local level because in many ways, those are the ones that we see the most impact from. But my family and I, we have three children, and my husband, so five of us, but the oldest one doesn't live here. We go to the polls and we always take a picture. When Kirk lived here, we took a picture with him too of our I voted today stickers, and people love them. It's just a simple picture of our hands with our stickers, and we're all bumping fists and just voted, no matter what the election is. And for me, that's the legacy that my grandmother, who is my kids' great grandmother, has given to them. That's the legacy of a Carter Maddox, or that's the legacy of a John Lewis's great great grandfather. That's the legacy of a Harriet Tubman. That's the legacy. Like we always are talking about Susan B. Anthony in Rochester, but we don't amplify the voices of the black suffragettes. And we don't talk enough about John Lewis or Ella Baker while we're talking about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Those are not conversations that we're having. Yes. Rachel says, yes, that weapon in the fight against anti-blackness and related violence and oppression. And we understand that there is so much um, deception. There is so much hatred and violence against the black body that's state sanctioned. We understand that no, we really don't know what happens to the votes, but people who don't care how their food gets from the beginning onto their table, when it comes to voting, somehow want to parcel that out and, oh, well, I need to know, you don't know that you vote this year. You don't know a lot of stuff, but you go along with it. And at the very least, I will vote, so I will have something to say about this process. It just means something to me. It means something very significant to me. Nancy says the pride and poise of that generation was and is powerful and humbling. I remember my grandma living proud in her blackness and womanhood. Right. And so when we think about the legacy of John Lewis, we think about a man who honors women. And so we have Nancy's grandmother, my grandmother, we have Dr. Arlette, we have all of us women being able to be in a space to honor this man who also honored women. A man who was born 80 years ago, but still you see him being very modern, dancing to happy with so much joy. And I think that's the thing that struck me in the documentary, the fact that they show him walking so much. And Rachel, this gets back to the when I started how I use film in literature classes. So if this were my classroom, I might have a conversation with my students about the significance of walking, that the actual physical body as a tool of resistance. And you have this man and these other people who are walking. They're walking through Selma. They're walking through Montgomery. They're walking through Nashville. They're walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They're walking instead of riding on the bus. And then you see John Lewis. He's walking amongst the people. He's walking upstairs. He's walking to his office. He's walking through his house. That even though this man is long past the physical days of the March on Washington or Bloody Sunday, we still see him walking. And I can talk about that and I can give people some explanation of that. But to have the visual to show them that you have this man who was beaten by the system, but he was not beaten by the system. I might be able to describe his joy. I might be able to give you some adjectives about how powerful he was or how people respond to him, that when they see him, they treat him like an uncle or a cousin or a brother or a father or a grandfather. But the immediacy of film, it allows us that press on connection, that we can see his warmth, we can see his joy, we can see his humor. And what it does for me is that it reminds me that I I can still be joyful. That this work is not going to beat me down. I can still be happy. That I can be frustrated. I can be worn out, but joy, what they say, joy comes in the morning. Rachel says he was also an example of how you can experience joy and pain at the same time in the same body, his full humanity, and in the same moment. That you can be prideful proud of rather, of an event, but then you also have some great sorrow. And speaking of this, I want to bring up something that was touched on in this documentary, but it was illuminated a little bit more in the Get in the Way documentary, um, about John Lewis and Julian Bond. Violent retaliation during the 60s was an expected reality. Sneaked out to see MLK in 65 at Pleasant Green Baptist Church. A kid pooped or popped. I'm sorry. I was like, they did what? I'm sorry. Popped a brown paper bag to traumatize you, right? Because that sounded like a bomb. That sounded like a fire bomb. That sounded like a shot. And so we have people that enact different tactics that make you nervous and keep you off of your feet, right? And so we know that John Lewis lived through all of that, but he still maintained some joy and some dignity and humility, as Rachel's talking about. So when we look at the John Lewis and the Julian Bond thing, um, that was a moment where John Lewis had a lot of pride about running for office. But in the other documentary, we can see more of the regret that he had about the ways that the campaign played out and impacted their friendship. And how that was something that, looking back all these years later, he would not have done again. In the John Lewis Good Trouble documentary, we don't get that sense of remorse. We get, okay, well, I had to do some things. uh, Rachel says it broke her heart. Dr. Arlette says in reference to her event in 65 that Dr. King, that everybody fell to the floor. They were so traumatized. And so Rachel, in that whole breaking your heart, I, for a moment, I was like, man, John Lewis, I'm upset. And I was like, wait a minute, I don't have the right to be mad at John Lewis. Who am I? Who I think I am? But I have to tell you that to see two strong black men who, as Julian Bond so eloquently and painfully said, listen, man, what are you doing? We basically grew up together. Our families have grown up together. We hang out together. We've gone to Disneyland together. And this is what you do? Now, what we don't really see in this documentary, is that, Julian Bond's drug test, he failed it. And that, of course, changed the campaign. We see Julian Bond say to John Lewis that more white people prefer you, and I was more popular with the black people. And I think that sort of challenge and that narrative plagued, I don't want to say plagued, but shaped a lot of John Lewis's um, life and his time in public. So we see him going against Stokely Carmichael for the leadership of SNCC, and understanding that we believe that what black revolutionary experiences look like. And one of the things in my literature, the Black Experience class, I talk to people. It's very easy to talk about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his experiences as a revolutionary, and as someone who was, a freedom fighter. But people don't think of that. They think of, Malcolm X or Angela Davis, Marcus Garvey. They think of things that are militarized as freedom fighters or revolutionary. But remember, if you're a revolutionary, you're doing something different than anybody else at that time is different. You're going against the current movement. And so when we look at someone like John Lewis versus someone like Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panthers, it's easy to say, oh, well, they were the more militant. But how many of us could have done what John Lewis did? How many of us have gotten rejected from college, or didn't get any word from college, rather, and we have the capacity to write one of the leading civil rights writers at the time? How many of us will have the audacious belief in ourselves? That's revolutionary. How many of us would, despite our mother's warnings and our mother's fear, would say, I'm leaving my hometown where I'm comfortable at, and being able to go to a whole different space where I know my life is not valued? That's revolutionary. Arlette says she thought she had died right there with Dr. MLK. And Rachel says it's complicated, right? But how precious is the prize? No judging just made me sad. It made me sad. And me and Kehlani were talking about it today. Me and Kevin were talking about it last night. But it was interesting because I had a heartbreaking moment. I'm like, man, we knew that there were going to be one black person to win because there were two black people in the race, which was their strategy. But there seemed to be something about the competition that stripped the humanity from one, and maybe tarnished in some ways the humanity of another. Because at the end of the day, and I think that we can look at our current climate, particularly locally, when we talk about the humanity of politicians, particularly black politicians that are from our community, and what are the ways that we engage with them, and what are the ways that we engage with other activists, and do we have to tear each other down? Like, I don't know. To use Rachel's word, it's complicated, but how precious is the prize? No, not no judging. It just makes me putting in a present tense. It just makes me sad. You know, that particular time was not the greatest look. I think. And John Lewis goes on to say that they brought it up. They asked him, and he said, let them take a test. Let them take a test. And we know what that means, because if you are my friend in the ways that they were friends, then you know my secrets. You might know my struggles. Maybe I confided in you that I had an addiction, right? But then in this example, we see that John Lewis is a person. I think that a lot of times that we deify our public servants, but being able to remember that they are full people is important. Rachel says it took a left turn, and what is the real prize? Like, yeah, we get a person, we get a black person. Either one of the leaders are wonderful men. I'm not sure what would have been different if Julian Bond were the congressperson. We have John Lewis, who already had a legacy, already fully entrenched at that point. But what is the real prize? Who loses? Who wins? And how do we, as everyday citizens, look to our leaders to be examples of grace and dignity? And so that period in John Lewis's legacy for me was not a it wasn't a tarnish. I understood why he did it, in the ways that I can understand as an observer decades later. But I just think that he knew what he wanted. And Rachel, you talked earlier about like our destiny, or somebody said earlier about our destiny. So if we're really talking about destiny, do we walk away from the things that we feel are ours? And do we do anything to win? Do we flip the information that is true in a way that people can see a broader picture? And so I think that John Lewis is really um, more complex and more complicated and more multi-layered. It's easy to dismiss him as a singing, dancing, chicken preaching guy who walked across a bridge, who got busted in the head, like this real simple kind of doo 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 doo. I'm just all the time happy, and I think he's much more multi-layered than that. I think that you have someone who has a very shrewd mind, who's very who knows that he's playing a game of chess and not checkers. I think that when we look at his legacy, that we are honored to have lived in a time where not only he lived, but he thrived. He had sharp elbows. He pushed a lot of things out of the way. He has a strong back because he carried a lot of us on his shoulders. And I think that the greatest gift that John Lewis, at least for me, has given me a blueprint for what my own activism can look like, what my own investment in our people can look like, what my own challenge to myself can look like. And I think that this idea of good trouble, of being able to understand that there are things that we are going to have to push beyond our own understanding and push beyond our own capacity as citizens, and be able to give up and use these sharp elbows. Maybe more of us are running for political office. Maybe more of us are doing voter registrations, holding food drives, creating cultural institutions where we are educating youth, women of color, black women, where we are cataloging our song and our joy practices, where we are doing guerrilla giving at the community level, where we are doing online fundraising, where we are being educators, where we are being strong parents, we are being strong community stewards, growing gardens, meditating, doing yoga, working out, raising money, being kind, dancing. When was the last time you saw an old black person dance? Other than Francis Hare. Because Frances here would kick her leg up to the sky and put everybody to shame. The one thing I'm glad about my radio show not being in person, because every Monday I would run into Frances, and she's like 70 years old, and she would throw her leg up in the air, and she's like, "Now you next." Now here I go trying to show out, and almost broke my back. But I welcome that, because to see her be so joyful to me is reminiscent what John Lewis gave us. To see somebody who, I don't know her life, I don't know a lot of people who are older than me's life, but to see an older black person full of joy, despite what anything ever tried to take away from them, we put a praise right there. Dr. Arlette says, think about how commercialized the fight was between civil rights leaders and Black Panther leaders, but how Lewis and Julian Bond moved beyond the full-fledged war against each other in their community. Dr. Arlette, in what ways did they move beyond it? Are you talking about in the moment of them running for office, or just them moving up to the office, or after their actual campaigning against each other and then moving beyond to whatever their new established friendship could be? Because I think you're absolutely right that there was a commercialized fight between civil rights leaders and the Black Panther leaders, and we saw that with Stokely Carmichael versus John Lewis. So you have the old guard or the Black Panthers versus the religious civil rights movement. And Tiana's like, yeah, Frances here does not come to play at all. She don't come to play. Rachel says, yes, an important part of the story was not in the film. Right. And that's the limit of something not being a docu-series. I think that the film will give enough people who are not familiar with John Lewis's life to be able to want to research. I hope that they really look up the archival footage. And I love PBS, so I tell my students, when we're looking up for their research project, they use a documentary as well. And we have several documentary sites on our school source, a library site, but I always encourage them to look up PBS. Oh, after the campaign, clearly Bond was wounded. Listen to me, Dr. Arlette. You are saying the truth. When he when they sat side by side and they were being interviewed, and he said that our families hung out together, all of that. But when John Lewis said, "Oh, we'll be fine. We're friends, and this campaign didn't do anything to harm that." And Julian Bond said, hmm, time. We have to give this thing time. That to me was, I'm all getting choked up. It was so heartbreaking. But he acknowledged that the two would work past their tension. He had hoped in time. But in the Good Trouble documentary, we don't see John Lewis. They use archival footage to say, oh, well, I did what I had to do at the time. But in the other documentary, Get in the Way, he says he regretted doing it. And that was the more current, the 2010s John Lewis, who understood that he had done some great harm to his friend. And I appreciated that, because it shows the duality of humanhood and humanity, and that even though you're a great leader, that you can make mistakes, that you might be someone who is intending to do the right thing, but that you can still hurt people. And that perhaps, Rachel, to tease out your question, that what is the prize? Is it worth it? So we're coming up on an hour. We usually go for an hour, 15 minutes when we're speaking about fiction stuff. I'm feeling very emotional about John Lewis today. I didn't watch his funeral services for that reason, because I did not want to cry, and I wanted to have something to have a conversation with you all today, because I just believe that, I've never been a person that got caught up on movie stars or film or musicians. But for me, John Lewis is the epitome of what self-determination can look like. Um, and I agree, Dr. Arlette, that there is an excellent research topic on those two young leaders. If anybody who watches this, even in the replay, sees that they can research Stokely Carmichael, they can research John Lewis, they can research a young Julian Bond. James asked earlier about Jesse Jackson, you know, really look Bayard Rustin, Ella Baker, Diane Nash, um, Septima Clark, really getting some different names into this civil rights, beyond Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., beyond the militancy of Malcolm X, really looking at the whole the whole gamut of the civil rights activists, from someone who was on the front lines to someone who was preparing the meals for Dr. King and his crew as they moved from town to town. Dr. Arla, what's the name of that book? The Lady with the Red House? You and I talked about it a lot of time a few years back, but it was a woman who was a cook, and she would feed Dr. King and his crew every time they came to the town. I can't think of the name of the book, but maybe we'll drop it after the Kaylana. If you have you can research that real quick. Um, but understanding that there were people who lived at the continuum. There was a continuum of civil rights activism, or black resistance activism, or black revolutionary activism. And at any time, one person could move along that continuum, but maybe they were more stationary, like a John Lewis. And then you have other ways that people operated in that dynamic. And when we look at this continuum of who gets to define who is revolutionary or not, who gets to define what resistance looks like. Judy Richardson, yes, she was a SNCC, yes. So we gotta look up the book. Can I Google Judy Richardson real quick? Maybe we can get that book title in here. So Rachel said the prize in terms of white supremacy. You know, um, what do people really try to gain? What is really lost in this fight to dismantle white supremacy, particularly for black people? One of the curses of John Lewis's existence is that he did not look like what he went through. So someone looking at him would not necessarily recognize the horrors on the Edmund Pettus Bridge until you see the archival footage of whole bodies being trampled over. Okay, you'll look on your civil rights shelf for it. Thank you, and I'll add it after we go off of the. It is very obscure. That's how you and I were talking about. You had found the book, you ordered it, and we had this conversation. So I will drop the title after the live is stopped, but it'll be in the comments. Um, but because he was joyful and happy, we don't know how much memory he lost. We don't know how much physical functioning he lost. I saw him walking with a limp. Did he have that limp right after? Or was that limp as a result of age? Because he was walking everywhere and all the time and was very much a man of the people. So what is the material cost of what he gave? What was what was taken from him? The onlyest. Rachel, can you expand upon that? When you say the onlyest, I know what the onlyest means, but maybe I lost the thread of it in our conversation. That we look at people, we talk about the onlyest a lot of times. We're talking about a person who wants to be the only one of a thing, and they stand firm at the individual idea. When we understand that black people are a community minded, we have more of a, unified. I am because you are, and we don't really have the individualized mentality, what we shouldn't, you know. Good question. So Rachel's question is, being the onlyest, is that the prize? If I throw my brother under the bus, or if I do something to disrupt the system that's trying to disrupt the system, and I somehow get placed in a position of authority, or become the thing that I wanted, is that my prize? Because now I am the only black person in this position. Mm. I ask that we all do our individual self work on that too, to make sure that we are not, out here just trying to get likes, or trying to get some prominence, trying to be the only person, the onlyest, as it were, in search of that prize. Are we furthering white supremacy? Are we buying into white supremacy? Are we practicing anti blackness? Are we, yes, whew, The House by the Side of the Road by Richie Jean Sherrod Jackson. Thank you, Dr. Arlette. I roll with a crew of scholars. That's what I'm talking about. The House by the Side of the Road, right? Check that book out. And Rachel offers that we should check ourselves. That's right. That's exactly the point I'm making. We always have to check ourselves. And if you find that you are the onlyest, that you are the only person that people are calling on, that you are pushing down other black people, that you are standing on top of the very people who had y'all were working with, then you got to check yourself. You can never allow yourself to become a tool of the state. And you can never allow yourself in your work to become the person who wants to be the onlyest and to have the only platform and to be the only one who's engaged in the work and the only one who gets all the spoils, the only one who has the microphone, the onlyest. And I think that, maybe there was some of that in John Lewis's fight with Julian Bond, and it was a fight, but that's what white supremacy does. It makes us believe that, we have to do something that's disruptive to our brother or our sister or our sibling, gender non-conforming folk, because we believe that there's only room for one. There's no reason why there's not another John Lewis. There's no reason why he can't have bred groups of people who will walk in his shoes, and we know that he has. I want to leave us tonight with a quote. First, I want to thank you all for being dynamic people, for watching the film. I hope you're sharing it with other people, but please, please watch Getting Away. Please. This documentary, I love John Lewis, so you could have shown him sitting at a table just looking out the window, and I'd be like, oh, John Lewis. But I would really have loved the documentary that built upon the other documentary, Getting Away. I want you to see that one. It's good. Um, so that you are able to maybe get a different perspective, but the same perspective in a lot of ways. It goes into the freedom rides a lot more. I love the freedom ride, so you can look at the PBS documentary, Freedom Riders. I own a DVD somewhere around here. Again, for those of you who might have joined us late, I want to again show, we put a book in the comments. We have the March book series. Oh, books are upside down. Don't forget to check those out. Rachel showed us He Talked to Chickens, the chickens, a children's book about his sermons to the chickens. I want to leave us with a quote. John Lewis says that when you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something. You have to do something. And that is where we'll leave off today. That in our speaking up and our doing something, we gain our humanity. That black people, we still have to be involved with the work, from voting, from bringing people along to vote, from running for public office, for creating spaces for us, for preserving our cultural legacy, for working within the system and on the outside of the system. You have to listen to Dr. Arlette Says, Danny Glover read Lewis's 1963 March on Washington speech. Listen to Danny Glover read it. Watch the archival footage of John Lewis delivering it. Look at him talk about how it felt to deliver the speech, to have to edit some things out, go on in there and being a young, was he 23? Something like that, year old, and just mystifying a nation of people. Like the poise that he had, but it's not too late for any of us. And we don't have to do big, large things in order for us to be great. And I think that that's where we get confused sometimes, that we think that our activism has to be out loud and it has to be, magnificent and bold. But we start right where we are. We feed one family. We drive one family to the polls. We have $5. We give a dollar to 5 different people. Those are the things that move our everyday humanity. That's the legacy that John Lewis. And my neighbor has some chickens. So I think that what I'm going to do is I'm going to go across the street and read a part of John Lewis's speech to the chickens in honor of him. And so with that, I thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you next month. I'm still taking apart my list. I had a list for the whole entire year of Soulstainable Living online literacy literary circle readings, but I realized they were all about pain. So we might show some more movies. We might bring a children's book the next time. I'm not sure, but if you haven't liked the Soulstainable Living uh, page, Soulstainable Living LLC with Takia C. Graham page, please do so. Please continue to share, trying to get to 20 likes in 2020. And we're expanding our activism, and I also want to present the Sustainable Living presents the Black Healing Project. So thank you all. I say so much to you all. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I love you all. And please do something this week in honor of the great elder, now an ancestor, Congressman John Lewis.